When we talk about extinction, we like to think of it as a full stop. A species vanishes, its bones turn to stone, and the last page of its story is sealed forever. Museums display the fossils, textbooks file them under extinct, and that's where it ends. Except, that's not always what happens. Every so often, nature betrays that sense of finality. An animal thought to be long gone appears alive, indifferent to the assumptions we've made about it. Scientists call them Lazarus species, but that name suggests something miraculous, when really they're evidence of how much we don't see, and how often our certainty collapses. And the best example didn't just break the rules, but it showed how fragile they really are. In 1938, a South African curator walked down to a fishing dock and was handed a specimen that should not exist. A fish believed to have been wiped out 65 million years ago, at the very end of the dinosaur's reign, was lying there fresh from the net. If extinction can fail for 65 million years, then what else have we misunderstood? The fish on the dock looked heavy in a way modern fish rarely do. Its scales caught the light like hammered metal, and its fins sat on bony stalks that flexed like small limbs, as if the animal were designed to push off a seafloor rather than flutter through open water. At that point, the coelacanth belonged to textbooks and museum drawers, a character from a chapter that supposedly closed with the dinosaurs. Yet here it was, very much part of the present. What made the moment so disorienting wasn't only the survival of a lineage tied to deep time, it was what that survival implied about the boundaries we draw between the fossil record and the living world. We like clean timelines because they help us make sense of the past, but fossils are a partial archive. They preserve what conditions allow, and most life never earns a page. When the coelacanth surfaced, it made that gap visible. The last appearance in rock was not the biography of the animal. It was the last time geology happened to catch it. As researchers studied further, it became clear that coelacanths haunt steep underwater slopes and volcanic caverns far below the reach of ordinary nets. Coelacanths move slowly and do most of their hunting at night, drifting through the dark with little urgency. Nothing about that lifestyle leaves obvious evidence for us. In other words, they survived not by defying evolution, but by slipping into a stable niche where the pace of change is gentle and the attention of humans is rare. The rediscovery also cracked open a simple question that will hover over everything else in this video. If something as conspicuous as a 6-foot fish can avoid us for so long, what smaller, quieter, or more remote creatures sit just beyond our habits of looking? To answer that, we move from the deep ocean to a shard of rock in the Pacific. Lord Howe Island sits between Australia and New Zealand, a quiet crescent of green surrounded by reefs. In the early 20th century, a grounded ship brought rats ashore. The change was immediate and brutal. Ground-nesting birds vanished, plants were chewed back, and one of the strangest residents, a glossy, hand-sized stick insect that people nicknamed the tree lobster, disappeared from the island within a few years. Naturalists concluded the story was over. On a small island, extinction feels certain because there are only so many places to hide. But out past the reef, a thin volcanic spire called Ball's Pyramid rises straight out of the ocean like a blade. It looks more like a monument than a habitat, with wind and spray battering bare rock, and only a few scrubby plants clinging where soil has managed to collect. And at first glance, it hardly seems like the kind of place that could shelter a population of anything for long. In 2001, climbers working with biologists noticed droppings beneath a single shrub halfway up the spire. They returned at night with headlamps and found large, dark insects perched on the branches, breathing with slow, unmistakable movements. The tree lobster had not survived on Lord Howe. It had survived on this cliff, on a ledge few people had ever visited, under a plant that barely counted as cover. Only a small number were present, but that was enough to begin a careful rescue. A tiny founder group was placed into a breeding program that operated under strict control, with individuals monitored from hatch to molt to adult as the population expanded one enclosure at a time, while conservation teams on Lord Howe worked in parallel on the rat eradication needed to make their eventual return possible. The story feels improbable because we imagine extinction as a sweeping force, when it can also look like a long retreat into a single defensible corner. The stick insect found a loophole the rats couldn't cross. It waited there for decades. Its rediscovery says less about luck than about the geography of survival. Even on islands we think we understand, there are ridges, crevices, and outcrops where the census never reaches. Our third story steps off the cliffs and into a market. In the 1990s, researchers surveying wildlife trade in Laos came across a rodent laid out on a table among ordinary game. It had a rounded body, long whiskers, and a tail with a tufted base that tapered to bare skin. Local vendors had a name for it and treated it as nothing special. Science had never formally met it. Specimens sent to the lab began to trouble the categories. The teeth did not match familiar rats. The jaw and skull felt like they had been borrowed from another time. When paleontologists compared the anatomy to fossils, a quiet realization settled in. This animal lined up with a family thought to have vanished more than 10 million years earlier. A branch known only from rock strata had been alive all along in the limestone hills of Southeast Asia, moving between boulders and shrubs, then occasionally making its way into a basket. The rock rat's quiet return complicates how we talk about extinction because it touches the limits of both records we rely on. An entire mammal family slipped between those two nets and was found not by a targeted expedition, but by curiosity at a market stall. If the rock rat showed how deep time can blur into the present, the next case shows how human history can do the same. When a bird believed lost for centuries suddenly called out again from the dark. In the early 1600s, sailors reaching Bermuda described nights filled with strange cries. A seabird known locally as the cahow nested in burrows and returned only under cover of darkness. When the English arrived, the birds were easy to catch and quickly became a convenient food source. And within a few decades, the cahow had disappeared from Bermuda's main islands, remembered only in passing notes about the haunting calls that once echoed at night. For 300 years, the assumption held. Then, in 1951, a team of researchers surveyed a cluster of rocky islets offshore. They found feathers, then burrows, and finally the birds themselves. Gray and white petrels returning from the sea after centuries of supposed absence. Fewer than 20 breeding pairs had managed to persist on those tiny outcrops, hidden from the introduced predators that had overwhelmed the main island. The rediscovery triggered a conservation project that continues to this day. Wardens blocked burrow entrances from rats, built artificial nests above storm lines, and even hand-reared chicks so they would return to safer sites when grown. The population remains fragile, but it has climbed into the hundreds. What looked like a voice, silenced for centuries, turned out to be a song carried quietly across storms, waiting for someone to listen again. The cahow's return was a reminder that extinction doesn't always mean silence forever, and it wasn't the only case. Thousands of miles away, high in the mountains of Papua New Guinea, local people spoke of a dog with a peculiar voice. Explorers and missionaries recorded hints of it, but by the late 20th century, biologists dismissed the stories. The only singing dogs known to science were a handful in captivity, and the species was written off as extinct in the wild. Then, in 2016, camera traps in the highlands captured images of slender, tan dogs with curled tails roaming through alpine meadows. They were not feral strays. Their proportions, posture, and behavior were distinct. Genetic samples confirmed what locals had been saying for generations. Wild singing dogs still lived in the mountains. What makes them extraordinary is not only their survival, but their voice. Singing dogs produce harmonic howls that layer together like a chorus, unlike any call heard from wolves or coyotes. To hear them echo across the valleys is to realize that something remarkable persisted in the highlands while the outside world decided it was gone. If the singing dog brought back a voice, the Cuban solenodon brought back an entire evolutionary relic. At first glance, it looks like an oversized shrew with a long, flexible snout and beady eyes. But hidden in its jaw is something unusual, grooves in its teeth that deliver venom, one of the rare mammals capable of injecting poison like a snake. Fossils show its lineage stretches back tens of millions of years. By the early 1970s, deforestation and introduced predators had pushed the solenodon to the edge. Field surveys turned up nothing, and the species was listed as extinct. Then in 1974, researchers found a small population still clinging on in remote patches of forest. The solenodon hadn't vanished, it had retreated into the corners of Cuba that human attention rarely reached. The animal is still endangered, and its rediscovery didn't guarantee safety, but it emphasized something important. Extinction can look like a clean break when viewed through reports and categories. On the ground, it often looks like attrition, numbers shrinking until only a scattered few remain, unnoticed until someone stumbles into them. The solenodon is awkward, rare, and fragile, but it embodies a lineage that predates most of what we recognize as modern mammals. Its rediscovery proved that even among familiar islands, remnants of deep time can persist in silence, waiting to be acknowledged again. At this point, it's hard not to notice the pattern that keeps emerging. The cahow survived by nesting on storm-lashed islets no one bothered to check. The singing dog survived in the highlands, carried in local memory even as outside science wrote it off. The solenodon survived in neglected forests, its rarity mistaken for absence. The coelacanth survived in the ocean's depths, hidden where nets rarely reached and science assumed only fossils remained. And the tree lobster survived on a single rocky outcrop, clinging to a few scraggly bushes when the rest of its kind was written off as gone. Each case seems improbable, yet together they describe something consistent. Extinction, as we describe it, is not always the end. Sometimes it is a story paused in a place we have not looked or refused to believe. That should leave us unsettled, because if 65 million years of supposed absence can end with a fish pulled from the deep, and if centuries of silence can end with the cry of a seabird on a remote islet, then our confidence in what is gone is far less certain than we like to think. Extinction feels final, but nature writes in drafts, and sometimes the pages we thought were closed are still being written.